All right, in this set of slides, I want to talk about the issue of Latino civil rights. Now, when we use that term Latino, right, or Hispanic, they're interchangeable, really. Although some would argue there are some fine distinctions, and I guess there are, but I use them interchangeably. We would say that this is a very broad label, right? Really, whether you're using the term Latino or Hispanic, it's a pretty broad label that encompasses a range of groups that are often quite different one from another. So we should also always recognize that from the beginning, right? So, are you talking about Mexican Americans? Are you talking about Cuban Americans? Are you talking about Puerto Ricans? Are you talking about those living here who maybe came from Brazil or Ecuador or Colombia or Panama? So each of those groups, right? They're going to have their own sort of unique historical trajectory, their own concerns, their own issues, their own points of view. So it can be deceptive to talk about the Latino community in the U.S. because it's a very diverse community. So as per our text, Chapter 5 on civil rights, we are going to cover in this part of the chapter three particular groups within the Latino community. We're going to talk about Mexican Americans, sort of a term that isn't used much anymore, but it was popular back in the 60s and 70s, was Chicano. That denotes kind of a politicized sense of identity as Mexican American, right, where you are intensely political about that identity. But I typically use the term Mexican American here. It's more commonly used. Puerto Ricans. I grew up on the East Coast. Puerto Ricans tend to be concentrated basically in New York and Philadelphia to a pretty high degree. Mexican Americans obviously concentrated much more in the American Southwest. And then Cuban Americans, those who came here from Cuba. All right, so let's talk about, we have two slides here on Mexican Americans and civil rights. If you're talking about that topic, where it really begins, I guess, you can always go further back in time, but a good place to start, I think, is the Mexican-American War, 1846 to 1848. I think we talked about that a little bit already. That was really, honestly, Henry David Thoreau was correct when he wrote about this back then. This was a kind of a land grab by the U.S. And I understand the temptation, right? We wanted to be a continental empire and reach the Pacific Ocean. And Mexico was weak, right? Newly independent from Spain. And they were in the way. And America was growing and powerful and ready to rumble. So we do rumble. And the U.S. emerges victorious in that war. And we seize, gosh, I think it's about a third of Mexico. We could have had more if we wanted it. But the U.S. decided we didn't want to really go too far south because most of the white people living in Mexico were living in northern Mexico. So the further south you went, the fewer white people. So we grabbed the top third via the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo. And that treaty, if you just read the treaty, you're like, oh, those who were Mexican citizens one day, right, and then American citizens the next after this treaty, the border crossed them rather than them crossing the border. They were told that in this treaty, specified, using good legal language, you can go further south and go back to where Mexico is now, further south, or you can stay here and become full U.S. citizens. Right? So the promises were pretty extravagant and legitimate, right? That's what you would expect in a case like this. So most of them stayed, right? And most of them found out pretty quickly that promise was pretty much a mirage. It did not work out the way the treaty language suggested that it would. That's often the case, right? That you see sort of what's on paper or parchment and what happens on the ground. Those can be very different things. That's certainly the case here. And what happened really was, right, you had more and more white people migrating west as America grew west. And you get the California Gold Rush in 1849. Right, 1 year after the war, same year as the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo. And right, a whole lot of white people coming to the American Southwest. And they were not happy to see so many brown-skinned people, to be blunt about it. And things went super badly for Mexican Americans in the Southwest as a result of the gold rush and lots of other issues as more and more white people moved into this part of the United States. Lynchings, right? Lynchings, I think we talked about that before. Just grotesque discrimination, dispossession of land and property and so forth. Some pretty harsh stuff took place. And as it always is the case, I think, a battle over power and scarce resources. So this, sort of catches Mexican Americans by surprise. This is not what we were promised in that treaty. This is not what's in the treaty, but it's what was happening on the ground. So they begin to push back by the late 1800s. Not hard, but they begin to push back. They're not in a position to push back hard. But they begin to form civil rights organizations. And by 1929, I always forget exactly what this acronym stands for. By 1929, you get a group that's still around today called LULAC, the League of United Latin American Citizens, LULAC. A pretty middle of the road, low key organization, which makes sense, right? Dude, it's 1929. You are not going to be some sort of a highly progressive organization advocating for the rights of Mexican Americans in 1929. But it's a start, right? It's a start. And I'm not sure that they were behind the landmark case of Texas v. Hernandez, but that was the kind of stuff they worked on, legal issues. And in Texas v. Hernandez, right, decided the same year as Brown v. Board of Education, the court rules that the 14th Amendment's Equal Protection Clause does apply to Mexican Americans, that they get the same equal protection as every other group. Because there had been an argument that the Equal Protection Clause really only applied to black people, because that's, right, the context in which we get that 14th Amendment was how do we protect the newly freed slaves from bad behavior by states in the South. So some thought that it only applied to black people. And the court said, nah, it applies to all the different racial and ethnic groupings, including Mexican Americans, white Americans, Asian Americans. It just applies across the board. So we get to the 1960s. We get to the 1960s, right? We've talked a little bit about that. We talked about the Black Civil Rights Movement. Turns out there's a whole lot going on in the 1960s in America. You got a young people's movement, partly based on opposition to the war in Vietnam and the mandatory draft. You got a pro-democracy movement. You get the women's movement. Yeah, it's quite a decade for social movements for traditionally marginalized groups, and among them, Mexican Americans. You get the Chicano Civil Rights Movement, beginning in about 1968. It didn't last very long. Probably only lasted till about 1971, 72 or thereabouts, and it was never terribly successful. Many argue that the timing was not good, right? That by 1968, as we've discussed, white Americans, the bulk of the population, especially at that time, white Americans had about had it with racial minorities making demands, right? So the Chicano Civil Rights Movement kind of hits a little too late to get a good foothold. But it was a real thing, and they did have some success. Most notable out in this part of the country, you got the LA public school blowouts, where young people in massive numbers walked out of schools in order to protest education issues, right? Latino schools serving Mexican Americans in LA tended to be under-resourced compared to suburban schools serving white students. The curriculum often didn't take into account the Mexican American experience. Nearly all of the teachers were white, right? All sorts of education issues here. This was designed to highlight those issues and try to get something done on them. You also get Cesar Chavez. Now, some debate. Was he part of the Chicano Civil Rights Movement, or was he a labor organizer? I tend to come down on the side of he was a labor organizer, albeit right? At that time, and I guess to a large extent still today, he helped organize agricultural laborers, right? Those picking the crops in the Imperial Valley in California, predominantly Mexican American. So he was primarily, I think, a labor organizer, but de facto was also organizing to a large degree, right, Mexican American labor. He's an important figure. I know there's a lot of landmarks now in the Inland Empire in particular, where you see his name on things like roads and parks and so forth. Contemporary issues. Here I'll just note quickly and in passing, immigration, right, has become a central issue, especially immigration on our southern border, the border that we share with Mexico. A lot of back and forth there between Republicans and Democrats. I'll note here that President Barack Obama, because Congress has been paralyzed for so many decades now, I think Congress, everyone in Congress thinks that indeed our immigration system is broken, but the two sides cannot agree on how to reform it, right? So broad agreement on there's a problem, Houston, we've got a problem, but very little agreement on what the solutions and reforms need to be. So as a result, tremendous political paralysis, going back at least to the presidency of Bill Clinton in the 1990s. It's been about 30 years, really, at least, since we've had significant congressional immigration reform. So we've kind of punted it, right, in some ways to the president, which is ridiculous, because if you look at the Constitution, Congress has plenary authority on immigration, not the president. But presidents, Democrat and Republican, have stepped into the vacuum left by Congress. So President Obama, some years ago, issued an executive order called DACA, Deferred Action on Childhood Arrivals, that says that if you arrived in the U.S. illegally as a minor, you are going to be protected from deportation, and you're going to get a card that allows you to work, a work permit. That applies to, I think in terms of how many signed up in the end, around 700,000 or thereabouts. So you have about 700,000. They're called dreamers, young people dreaming, right, the American dream. And so they're still protected under DACA, still protected from deportation, as long as they don't get in trouble with the law, mind you, and as long as they're taking care of business as good neighbors, going to school, maybe serving in the U.S. military, working, right, starting a family. That unless you're sort of a bad actor, you're a dreamer, you're protected from deportation, and you can get a work permit. Trump tried to vacate DACA for procedural reasons only. The court rejected that. And I think currently new signups for DACA are frozen. Although if you haven't signed up by now, I'm like, what are you waiting for? I think new signups are currently on hold because of a single federal judge down in Texas. So DACA is currently sort of still there. If you're signed up, I believe you can still re-sign up every 2 years, I think it is. So in that sense, DACA is alive, but not well. No new signups are allowed. But if you're already on the list, you can continue to renew every 2 years. So it's still kind of sort of there while that case is heard on appeal. And those protected, about 700,000 or so, they are called the dreamers. That's kind of a big issue. Right? That's been very back and forth. And there's other issues related to that, right? Should we or should we not continue building a wall on our southern border? Obama versus Trump versus Biden, blah, blah, blah. What about the Remain in Mexico policy, blah, blah, blah. What about political refugees? Just on and on. And this has relevance for Americans in general, of course, but many would argue it has particular relevance for Mexican Americans.